Hey there, this is Conflict Tales. You won't believe what went down this time. Let's dive into the madness. Homeowner Association just sent me a letter demanding that I tear down my fence because, according to them, it was illegally constructed. The problem? That fence had been standing for over 15 years, and I had the property records to prove it. I moved into this neighborhood 3 months ago, hoping for a quieter life after years of battling in courtrooms. As a real estate attorney, I had seen all sorts of legal battles over property disputes, but I never expected that I would become the target of a power-hungry homeowner association. When I bought the house, I made sure to check all the paperwork thoroughly. My fence was legally placed and there were no outstanding violations. But Homeowner Association had other plans. The letter was vague but aggressive. Per Homeowner Association Regulation 6.2, all fences must be in compliance with current zoning standards. Your fence does not meet the updated criteria and must be removed within 14 days. I knew exactly what this was. Homeowner Association wasn't enforcing any real law. They were testing me, trying to see if I would fold under pressure. I wasn't going to. The next morning, I stepped outside with my coffee and found Karen waiting for me. She stood on my lawn, arms crossed, a self-satisfied smirk on her face. Her blonde hair was meticulously curled and she wore a floral blouse that screamed, "Neighborhood Dictator." Her voice dripped with artificial politeness. "Good morning, Mr. Weller. Have you had a chance to review the notice?" I took a sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch just enough to make her uncomfortable. "I did. It's nonsense. The fence is legal." Her smirk didn't waver. "Oh, I'm sure you believe that, but we've recently updated our zoning guidelines. We must maintain consistency in the community. It's nothing personal." I exhaled slowly, suppressing a laugh. "It's absolutely personal. You don't get to change property lines by issuing a letter. I checked the county records before I moved in. My fence hasn't moved in 15 years. If you want me to take it down, you're going to need a court order." Karen's eyes darkened for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered. "I would hate for this to become a bigger issue, Mr. Weller. Homeowner Association has ways of ensuring compliance. We prefer things to be handled amicably." "I bet you do," I said, my voice steady. "I'll be in touch with my attorney." That was the first shot fired. Over the next week, things escalated quickly. I started receiving fines for ridiculous infractions. Improper landscaping, because I hadn't pruned my hedges to Homeowner Association specifications. Unauthorized parking, because my car was an inch over the painted driveway line. Excessive noise violations, even though I lived alone and barely made a sound. Then the vandalism started. One morning, I walked outside to find a long scratch running across the hood of my car. The next night, someone threw garbage onto my lawn. And then came the worst of it. My daughter, Emily, visiting for the weekend, rushed inside, visibly shaken. "Dad, there was some guy taking pictures of our house. He just stood there with his phone, and when I looked at him, he walked away." That was it. They wanted to intimidate me. They wanted me to feel cornered. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I spent the weekend compiling every piece of documentation I had: property records, fence permits, Homeowner Association bylaws, the county zoning laws. Then I went further. I started looking into the Homeowner Association itself. I found something interesting. No record of a community vote on the new zoning rules. That meant any recent changes were invalid. I wasn't just going to fight them. I was going to dismantle their entire case. That Monday, I paid a visit to the county clerk's office. "I need a certified copy of the original zoning plan for my neighborhood," I told the receptionist. She clicked around on her computer and frowned. "That's strange. Looks like there was an amendment filed 3 months ago, right before you moved in. But there's no record of a vote." Bingo. I knew Karen was up to something, but I needed more. That's when I reached out to Lucy Green, a local journalist who had written about Homeowner Association abuses before. She was skeptical at first, until I showed her the fines and the intimidation tactics. "This might actually be something," she admitted. Let me make some calls. The next time I saw Karen, I was ready. I waited until the next Homeowner Association meeting, walking in just as Karen was addressing the board. "Mr. Weller," she said, her voice oozing condescension. "I wasn't expecting you." "I'm sure you weren't," I said, dropping a thick folder onto the table. "This is a formal demand letter. Your new zoning rules, completely unenforceable. You didn't hold a community vote, which means they violate the Homeowner Association bylaws. That makes every fine, every letter, every threat illegal." A murmur spread through the room. Karen's face twitched. "Mr. Weller, there's no need to be hostile." "Hostile? You vandalized my car. You harassed my daughter. You sent anonymous complaints trying to smear my name. I'd say I'm being downright friendly considering what I could be doing right now." Karen's smile finally cracked. "What do you want?" I leaned forward. "You're going to rescind every fine you've issued me. You're going to acknowledge in writing that my fence is legal. And if you even think about trying something like this again, I will personally ensure this Homeowner Association gets audited so hard they'll be finding your financial discrepancies for the next 10 years. Silence. Karen clenched her jaw, looking at the board members for support. But they were shifting in their seats, avoiding eye contact. They knew I had them cornered. Finally, she nodded. "We'll discuss your request." "No, you'll agree to it. Now, or we go to court." A long pause, then, through gritted teeth, she said, "Fine." I walked out of that meeting victorious, but I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat easily. And sure enough, when I got home, I found an envelope in my mailbox. No return address, just a single piece of paper inside. "You won this round, but be careful." I smirked. Let the games begin. The next morning, I woke up to a loud banging on my door. I knew it wasn't going to be good news. When I opened it, a man in a cheap suit and an even cheaper attitude stood in front of me, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Weller, my name is Greg Langley. I represent the Homeowner Association's legal counsel. We need to discuss the ongoing violations on your property." I leaned against the doorframe, sipping my coffee. "Violations that don't exist, you mean? I thought we settled this at the last meeting." Greg's smile was thin. "That meeting was merely the beginning of our discussions. The board has decided to conduct a full compliance review of your property. If you refuse to cooperate, we may be forced to escalate this matter legally." I took another sip, pretending to consider his words. "Oh? And what exactly are you planning to escalate? The fines you issued illegally? The zoning changes you never voted on? Or maybe the vandalism that mysteriously started happening the moment I stood up to Karen?" Greg's expression didn't change, but I could see a flicker of irritation. "We don't control what individual residents do, Mr. Weller. However, we do have the authority to enforce Homeowner Association regulations, and I would hate to see this situation get any worse for you." I tilted my head. "Are you threatening me, Greg?" His smirk returned. "I'm giving you an opportunity to resolve this amicably. It would be in your best interest to accept it." I nodded slowly, then took a step forward, lowering my voice. "And it would be in your best interest to tell Karen that I'm just getting started." Greg's confidence wavered for a split second before he turned and walked away. By that evening, the retaliation began. A notice was taped to my door, this time claiming that my driveway had an unauthorized extension, and that I would need to apply for approval, along with a non-refundable processing fee of $500. The next day, I received a letter from a property inspector requesting access to my home for an evaluation of compliance. Then, my water bill inexplicably doubled overnight. I knew exactly what they were trying to do. I needed more leverage. That's when I called Lucy. "I need you to dig deeper. Find out everything you can about Karen and Greg Langley. Something tells me this isn't their first time pulling this stunt." She laughed. "Already on it, and you might be interested in what I found. The last guy who fought them? He left the neighborhood suddenly last year, didn't even sell his house, just packed up and disappeared." A chill ran down my spine. "That doesn't sound normal." "It gets better," she continued. "I checked public records. There's a pattern. Every few years, a homeowner mysteriously falls out of compliance, racks up thousands in fines, and either sells under market value or just vanishes. The Homeowner Association then acquires the property through an affiliate company and resells it at a premium. It's a racket. I exhaled slowly. Which means if I keep fighting, I might be next. Exactly, she said. So what's the plan? I stared at the notice on my door, my mind racing. We hit them where it hurts. We expose the whole operation. That night, I didn't sleep. I spent hours going through Homeowner Association financial records, tracking down property sales, following the paper trail. Lucy provided names of homeowners who had disappeared, and I started making calls. By morning, I had spoken to 3 former residents, each with eerily similar stories. They had been pressured, fined into submission, and forced out. None of them had the resources to fight back. But I did. I drafted a legal complaint and filed it with the county. Then I sent a letter to Greg Langley's office. Dear Mr. Langley, this letter serves as formal notice of my intent to challenge the Homeowner Association's pattern of fraudulent enforcement. I have collected evidence of unlawful property acquisitions, failure to adhere to due process, and financial misconduct. I strongly advise you to reconsider your course of action before we proceed to court. Regards, Mark Weller. By noon, my phone rang. It was Karen. Mr. Weller, I'm sure we can come to an agreement. There's no need to get the courts involved. I smiled to myself. Oh, I think there is. The game had just changed. The next morning, I wasn't surprised to find another letter taped to my door. This time, it was a formal notice stating that I was now under a compliance investigation, and that Homeowner Association inspectors would be conducting an assessment of my property within the next 48 hours. It was their latest attempt at intimidation, and I knew they were scrambling. Karen's voice still echoed in my head from our last phone call. She was trying to negotiate, which meant she was scared, but that also meant they were planning something bigger. They weren't going to roll over quietly. I spent the day preparing. I documented everything: the letters, the fines, the phone calls, and the suspicious property transactions Lucy had uncovered. I made 3 copies, one for my lawyer, one for the county records office, and one for the press. Then I called Lucy. They're sending inspectors. It's a setup. She sighed. Figured as much. You want me to be there? No, I need you working on the financials. I want to know who's funding Homeowner Association's property takeovers. Someone's benefiting from this scheme, and it's not just Karen. That night, I installed 2 security cameras, one overlooking my driveway and another pointed at my front yard. If they were going to try anything shady, I wanted it recorded. The inspection team arrived 2 days later. 2 men in polos with clipboards accompanied by Greg Langley. He had traded his cheap suit for a more casual look, but his smug grin was still the same. Mr. Weller, we're here to conduct a routine property compliance check. I stepped aside and let them in. By all means, just know that every second of this is being recorded. Greg's smile faltered slightly, but he nodded. Of course, we're just making sure everything is up to Homeowner Association standards. For the next hour, they nitpicked every inch of my property. They measured my lawn height, scrutinized my gutters, and even checked the spacing between my driveway pavers. It was absurd. Then, one of the inspectors suddenly pointed to my backyard fence. This section looks like it's been recently modified. Do you have a permit for alterations? I frowned. It hasn't been modified. That fence has been standing since I moved in. Greg stepped closer, flipping through his notes. That's not what our records show. According to our files, this fence was adjusted within the last 6 months, and any structural changes require Homeowner Association approval. Without a permit, this is a violation. I exhaled sharply. That's a lie. Your records are wrong, and unless you can provide real evidence, I suggest you tread carefully with your accusations. Greg's expression remained neutral. We'll be issuing a formal violation notice. You'll have 7 days to either obtain a permit or remove the fence. I smirked. Go ahead, but you might want to check county records before you embarrass yourself further. I already did, and my fence is legally grandfathered in. If you try to force this, I will countersue. Greg clenched his jaw but didn't argue. He knew I had him. That night, I reviewed the footage from my security cameras. At 2:13 a.m., a shadowy figure approached my backyard and appeared to be tampering with the fence. My blood ran cold. They were trying to fabricate evidence against me. I called Lucy immediately. "You were right, they're not just playing dirty, they're committing fraud," she cursed. "I'm almost done with the financials. And you're going to love this. There's a shell company tied to every Homeowner Association acquired property. Same LLC, different frontmen. But the real owner, it's someone inside Homeowner Association." I sat down, gripping my phone. "Who is it?" She took a breath. "Greg Langley." It all made sense now. The illegal fines, the forced compliance violations, the mysteriously disappearing homeowners. It was all orchestrated so Homeowner Association could acquire properties at a fraction of their value and resell them for massive profits. Greg wasn't just a legal advisor. He was running a full-scale property scam, using Homeowner Association as his personal money machine. I grinned. "Send me everything. It's time to burn them to the ground." The next morning, I filed a fraud complaint with the county, attaching my evidence: tampered fence footage, falsified violation records, and Lucy's financial report linking Greg to the scheme. Then, I made sure a copy found its way to the local news. By noon, my phone rang. It was Greg. "Mr. Weller, I think we need to talk." I chuckled. "Oh, Greg, you're about 24 hours too late. The county is already reviewing your records and the news station loves a good corruption story. You might want to start looking for a lawyer." Silence. Then, in a lower voice, he muttered, "You don't know what you've just started." I hung up. The real war had begun. The fallout started faster than I expected. By the next morning, the news report had aired, detailing the Homeowner Association's shady property acquisitions, the fraudulent violations, and Greg Langley's direct financial ties to the whole operation. The story spread quickly. Local radio, online forums, and even a few national watchdog groups picked it up. Homeowner Association members were panicking, and it was obvious. I saw Karen pacing in her driveway, on the phone, her free hand gesturing wildly. Greg, however, had gone completely silent. No visits, no phone calls, no more fake violations. It was almost disappointing. I was expecting him to at least try to fight back. Then, at exactly noon, I received an email from an anonymous sender. The subject line was short: "Walk away." I opened the message. "You've done enough damage. You don't know what you're stepping into. Drop the case before it gets worse. Last warning." No threats, no direct accusations, just a vague attempt at intimidation. But that was all I needed to know. Someone was still trying to protect Greg, which meant they still had more to hide. I forwarded the email to my lawyer and Lucy. "Looks like someone's getting nervous," I texted. Lucy responded immediately. "Be careful. That's not just an empty threat." That evening, Lucy called. "The county officials are moving fast on this. They're launching an internal audit of Homeowner Association finances, and Greg's name is at the top of the list. But I found something else. Another property, foreclosed last year, under the same shell company. The owner, former Homeowner Association president." I let that sink in. So it's not just Greg. It's the entire board. Looks that way. The president stepped down last year, but according to the records, he sold his house under market value before disappearing. This has been going on for a long time. I exhaled. This isn't just a scam. It's a full-blown racket, and they just realized I'm not going anywhere. The next day, I had a visitor. An older man, well-dressed, confident, with a polite but firm demeanor. He introduced himself as Thomas Harrington, a private attorney representing interested parties. He wasted no time. "Mr. Weller, let me be frank. The current situation is unfortunate, and my clients believe it's in everyone's best interest to resolve this quietly. No more fines, no more harassment. You'll receive compensation for the trouble, and in return, you drop all pending complaints and step away from any further action." I smirked. "So, bribe me to walk away. That's your offer?" His face remained neutral. Think of it as an amicable settlement, a way to ensure peace for all involved. Including Greg? I asked. Greg has made mistakes, but the people I represent prefer discretion. If you continue, things may become more complicated. There it was, the veiled threat. I leaned forward. Tell your clients I'm not for sale, and if they think threats are going to scare me, they clearly haven't been paying attention. Harrington sighed, standing up. You should reconsider, Mr. Weller, for your own sake. That night my security cameras caught movement. 2 figures in hoodies, moving around my property, scoping out my house. They didn't break in. They didn't vandalize anything. They just made sure I knew they were there. I called Lucy. They're getting desperate. She didn't sound surprised. It means you're winning. But be careful. If they're willing to escalate, they might have more to lose than we thought. The next morning, another letter appeared at my doorstep. But this time, it wasn't from Homeowner Association. It was a cease and desist from a major real estate firm, claiming defamation over my accusations. Their lawyers were high-profile, expensive. This was a power play. I showed the letter to my lawyer. He skimmed it and scoffed. This is nothing but an intimidation tactic. They have no real case. You sure? I asked. He nodded. If they take this to court, they'll have to open their financial records, which is the last thing they want. They're bluffing. That was all I needed to hear. I made a few copies and forwarded them to the journalists covering the story. If Homeowner Association wanted to play dirty, I was going to make sure the world saw just how deep their corruption ran. That night, another email came in. This time, it was just one line. You have no idea what you've started. I leaned back in my chair and smiled. Oh, I think I do. The final showdown came faster than I expected. The morning after I sent copies of the cease and desist letter to the press, I woke up to a knock at my door. It wasn't Karen. It wasn't Greg. It was 2 men in dark suits, standing on my porch with unreadable expressions. One of them, a tall man with sharp eyes, flashed a badge. Mr. Weller, we'd like to have a word. I let them in, keeping my face neutral as they stepped into my living room. The taller one introduced himself as Agent Foster and his partner as Agent Diaz. We're with the State Financial Crimes Division. We understand you've been investigating certain financial irregularities related to the Homeowner Association. I nodded, keeping my voice steady. That's right. And judging by the fact that you're here, I'm guessing you found something too. Agent Diaz leaned forward, resting his hands on the back of my chair. What we've found is a pattern of fraudulent property seizures, shell companies funneling money, and board members with direct financial interests in these transactions. Greg Langley isn't just a legal advisor. He's been orchestrating a scheme that involves multiple neighborhoods, not just yours. That was bigger than I thought. And Karen? Agent Foster exchanged a look with his partner. Karen was a willing participant. She facilitated false violations, pressured homeowners, and ensured foreclosures went through smoothly. But she's just one part of a much larger operation. I exhaled. So what happens now? Agent Diaz folded his arms. We need everything you have. Documentation, recordings, financial records, anything that can tie this scheme together. With your cooperation, we can build an airtight case. I didn't hesitate. You'll have it by the end of the day. As soon as they left, I called Lucy. You're not going to believe this. It's bigger than we thought. State-level fraud, multiple neighborhoods, millions in stolen property value. She swore under her breath. That explains why they've been escalating. If this crumbles, a lot of people are going down. I spent the next 12 hours compiling every single document I had, cross-referencing Homeowner Association acquisitions, correlating them with Greg Langley's known business interests, and double-checking financial discrepancies Lucy had uncovered. By midnight, I sent the compiled report to the agents. Then I waited. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind. The local news picked up the story first, exposing the corrupt Homeowner Association practices and fraudulent property takeovers. Then the real hammer dropped. Greg Langley was arrested at his office. The footage of him being escorted out in handcuffs was played on every news channel. Karen was next, taken from her home in the early hours of the morning. The state launched a full investigation into multiple homeowner association boards, and within a week, at least 5 more homeowner association executives were implicated in the scam. The neighborhood was in an uproar. Residents who had previously been afraid to speak out came forward with their own horror stories. The new homeowner association board members, who weren't tainted by corruption, held an emergency meeting. They voted to dissolve the board entirely, turning the neighborhood into a non-homeowner association community. The nightmare was finally over. A few days later, I received another email. No sender name, no subject, just one line. "You got lucky." I smirked and closed my laptop. "No," I muttered to myself. "I made my own luck." As I stepped outside, I saw neighbors talking freely, no longer whispering in fear of homeowner association retaliation. The relief in the air was palpable. My phone buzzed. It was Lucy. "You did it, Mark. You took them down." I took a deep breath. "Yeah, but something tells me this won't be the last time I cross paths with people like them." She laughed. "Maybe, but next time they'll know better than to mess with you." I glanced at my fence, the same one they tried to use against me. It was still standing, and so was I.